Declaration of Independence is one of our founding documents. It articulates our political values. It's something that we study as children in school, and we talk about it. It shows up in movies and popular culture. It's this celebrated document, but the tragedy is most people don't know the backstory. They don't know how we got the Declaration of Independence. And it's really the product of over a century of debate within the church over what's the relationship between Christians and their government. Is it okay for Christians to rebel against their government? Is that a sin? Well, the Declaration of Independence is the culmination of that debate, and so it's just a fascinating story. The story really begins with the Protestant Reformation. For centuries, Christians had believed that they were obligated to submit to those in authority. And this was true of political authorities, and it was true of spiritual authorities. Well, Martin Luther rebels against the Pope. So he defies the spiritual authority of the day. And there's this question of, well, what about political authorities? Well, Luther comes back and says, no, you still have to submit to political authorities, but the question is there. And all across Europe, you've got this back and forth, this conflict between Catholics and Protestants. And some nations are kind of moving in a Protestant direction, others are staying in the Catholic orbit. And today we think of Catholics and Protestants as kind of all being within the family of Christians, but that wasn't how they thought about it back then. And that conflict spills over into Britain. Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church because he wanted to get a divorce. It wasn't really a break of conscience that he theologically agreed with the Protestants over the Catholics. It was just he was politically at loggerheads with the Pope. But this has opened up the door to the growth of the Protestant Church in Britain. And so now we've got a culture war going on in Britain between Catholics and Protestants, or what you might kind of term high church Anglicans. They're not officially Catholic, but they want a very Catholic-ish Church of England. And they're going back and forth over things that, from our vantage point, seem kind of trivial. So for example, is it okay to celebrate Christmas? This is one of the things they debated. Or what about going to the theater? Or where should the communion table be positioned? At the front of the church or at the back of the church? Or what about soccer? Is it okay to play soccer on Sundays? Mary Tudor comes to the throne. She wants to take the country in a more Catholic direction, and so she's persecuting Protestants. Well, this Scottish theologian named John Knox comes along, and he's arguing, not only can you rebel against her, well, you should rebel against her because she's a heretic, she's not godly, there's no sin in that. So this is the beginnings of this debate in Britain over whether or not it's okay for Christians to rebel against the king, against the one in authority. And this whole Catholic versus Protestant debate is just raging in Britain. And it persists throughout the 1600s. There's a lot of conflict again between Protestants and these kind of high church Anglicans. The Scottish, they rebel, and at the time the king is Charles I, and so he decides he needs to go in and suppress this rebellion. Another Scottish theologian by the name of Samuel Rutherford, he comes along and argues, look, you're only obligated to submit to a godly king. Charles is not governing in a godly manner, therefore Christians owe him no submission, right? You have a duty, in fact, to rebel against him. So Charles is trying to suppress this rebellion in Scotland, but to do it, he needs money, right? He needs taxes, and he's got to get that from Parliament. Charles goes to Parliament, and he's wanting taxes, but a lot of the people in Parliament, they're Puritans. They're kind of at one end of the spectrum here, where they're very reformed, they're very strongly opposed to the Catholic Church, and they're very hesitant to give Charles the money he needs for an army. And so what they want to do is create an army but they want Parliament to be in control of the army, and that way Charles can't get too powerful. Well, Charles is upset about that, and so he says, well, I'm going to go get my own army. So now all of a sudden, Parliament has an army, Charles has an army, and a civil war starts in Britain and fights between kind of the high church Anglicans and the Protestants, the Puritans, that are they're really kind of the low church, Anglicans on the other side. They fight it out, and the Puritans win, and Oliver Cromwell comes in. And under Cromwell, you have a very strong effort to kind of take Britain in the Protestant direction. Well, Cromwell dies. Charles's son ends up coming back in, right? The pendulum swings back in the other direction. And so now you've got Charles II trying to take the church more in a high church kind of, direction, and there's more conflict that goes on here. Well, then Charles dies, and James, his brother, comes to the throne. And the key thing with James is he's openly Catholic. And so a lot of people are very concerned about the direction of the country. He has a son who will be Catholic, and this opens up the door to an endless series of Catholic monarchs. And so at that point, Parliament invites the Dutch essentially to invade and take over the government. There's essentially kind of a coup. James II flees, but there's this question of, well, was that okay? Was it all right for the Dutch to come in and displace Charles? And so there's this theological debate that's going on in the midst of this political crisis. And at one end of the spectrum, you've got this guy named Robert Filmer. And Filmer essentially argues it's a sin to rebel against the king. And he gets into this nitty-gritty details about the book of Genesis, and when God created the world, he gave it to Adam, and that made Adam the king of the world, essentially. And so all monarchs draw their authority from Adam, from this donation of authority. Kings have a divine right to rule. Well, at the other end of the spectrum is John Locke. Locke has been living in Holland kind of as an exile, and he writes this book called The Two Treaties of Government. And in the first treatise, he makes a theological argument that kings do not have a divine right to rule. And he says, look, when God created the world, he didn't give it to Adam personally, he gave it to us all collectively. We all have an equal share in governing. And therefore, you can't simply say that the king has a divine right to rule. Then in the second treatise, which is the one that everybody studies when they're in school, he says, all right, well, if that's true, then how are we to govern ourselves? Well, the king only governs with the authority that we give it. And in that sense, the king is our employee, right? He's there to protect our life, our liberty, our property. And so if the king's doing a good job, that's great. If he's not, well, then we can and should rebel against him and displace him. And that's what Parliament did in Locke's view, right? James II wasn't safeguarding our life, liberty, and property, so there was nothing wrong, there was no sin in inviting William of Orange to come in and to take the throne. So while all of this conflict is going on in England, people are migrating to the Americas. And so the political situation in England is kind of driving some of this. And you get a lot of Puritans that come over to New England when they're kind of on the losing side, right, under Charles I. And later on, you get more Anglicans, kind of the high church variety. They come over and they're settling kind of down in the South. You've got a good number in New York City. And so this has kind of impacted the theological composition of the country, if you will. Well, then what happens is you get the 7 Years' War, and England has accrued all of this debt, and so they're wanting to pay down some of the debt. They're wanting to consolidate their empire, and so they start trying to put taxes on the colonists. The colonists, particularly those in New England, say, wait a minute, we didn't agree to this, right? It's one thing if our local legislature does that, but Parliament doesn't have the right to put a tax on us. And when they're making this argument, it's very similar to the arguments that their Puritan forebears made against Charles I. In a sense, they're kind of reliving, the conflict that Granddad went through. Granddad wasn't going to let Charles I, get taxes without the authority. Well, we can't let Parliament put taxes on us without authority. But in other places where you've got Anglicans, like in New York City in the South, well, they're viewing this very differently, because in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, the execution of Charles I, the rebellion, this is a heinous sin. This is something that you need to confess and repent. And so they see this political drama unfold, and they're thinking, oh no, we're not going to make the same mistake that happened earlier. We've got to stand by the king. We've got to stand by Parliament. So you get these deep divisions in the country, and initially they're known as political differences between the Whigs and the Tories. Well, eventually they kind of shed those names and they become known as the Patriots and the Loyalists. And so you've got dueling speeches and all these pamphlets, and you've got dueling sermons. You have this guy named Jonathan Mayhew, and on the anniversary of Charles I being executed, he gives this sermon where he says this was a good thing, right? We should have deposed Charles I. We don't have this unlimited submission to the government. That sermon is delivered prior to the Revolution, but it gets printed up as a pamphlet and distributed to everybody, and it's very influential, again, especially in New England. But on the other hand, you've got people like Jonathan Boucher, and he's an Anglican, and so he's arguing, no, this is wrong. This is a sin to rebel. You need to stay loyal to the government. We're all British subjects, and so we should stay loyal to the king and the Parliament. And he's preaching with a loaded pistol behind the pulpit in case somebody tries to come in and kill him while he's preaching. Well, as the conflict goes on, you've got fights between, of course, the Americans and the British, but also fights among the Americans, right? Most people are on the kind of patriot side of things, but there are a significant number of loyalists, and so there's some intense fighting on the battlefield between Americans that are loyalists. Benjamin Franklin's son is actually one of the better known loyalists who's on the British side of this. Well, into this is where Jefferson and others write the Declaration of Independence. They're trying to create a document that explains why we feel we have the right to rebel against the king, and the king is not ruling with the divine right from God. The language in the Declaration of Independence makes it clear that for the Patriots, Locke is very influential, a key political philosophy that they want to build the new country on, drawing on a century of theological and political debate that's gone on in the church over whether it's okay for Christians to rebel against their king.